Hello, I'm Daniel Simpson, the host of Ancient Futures. If you're hearing this, you're listening to a preview of an archived podcast. For the full conversation, go to ancientfutures.substack.com, the link is in the show notes, and become a paid subscriber. Or you can also sign up for a free 7-day trial with no obligation. If you already subscribe, however, you have access to everything via the website, where you can go to your account page to set up a feed to your favourite podcast app. Just follow the instructions at ancientfutures.substack.com/account. Now, everything is free at the time of release, so it's also possible to subscribe without any charge to get the latest episodes direct to your inbox, along with other interviews and things that I write. All of that does take time to produce, though, so while it's a labour of love, subscriber donations do help make it sustainable. But if you're not in a position to pay, just send me a message and we'll work something out. For now, on with the preview. Hello and welcome to Ancient Futures, where we ask how ideas might evolve without disconnecting from earlier traditions. I'm Daniel Simpson, and today I'm joined by Anjali Rao, who is the author of a new book called Yoga as Embodied Resistance, which shares some stories of resilient women as part of a feminist perspective on history. As we discuss, Anjali also talks about links between gender and caste, as well as the impact of colonisation on social hierarchies and much else besides. However, her work isn't abstract in its politics. She is encouraging practitioners to think about ways in which they can expand their perspective on yoga and also on the traditions that have handed it down to us, with the aim of both resisting injustice and seeking collective, rather than individual, liberation. Now, part of how Anjali does this is by highlighting stories that have been given a bit less attention by historians of yoga, because we don't actually know all that much about female practitioners. The Sanskrit texts that are most often studied were written by men, and they describe male yogis. So this is a topic that we discuss at some length, and it's also a focus on my year-long course, The Path of Knowledge, which is starting soon. There's still time to join us. If you want to find out more, go to truthofyoga.com. And for more about Anjali's book, as well as the rest of her work, see the links in the show notes. And finally, for more about this podcast, including access to the archives as a paying subscriber, or to make a small donation that helps keep me going, visit ancientfutures.substack.com. For now, though, let's explore a blend of critical thinking and devotional practice with Anjali Rao. Welcome to the podcast, Anjali. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
It's a real pleasure to be chatting. We've just had a little bit of a chat before we pushed the button and got started. And I really appreciate the wide-ranging inquiry that's gone into producing this book that you're bringing out, Yoga as Embodied Resistance. And in some ways, yoga is, as understood in many global contexts these days, all about pushing up against embodied resistance, because it's about making shapes in many people's minds. But it's not the kind of embodied resistance that you're talking about. The subtitle talks about your perspective on this, a feminist lens on caste, gender, and sacred resilience in yoga history. But I would say, actually, it's as much about, yoga's future as yoga history that you're asking us to think about, because it's about, what do we bring as people engaged in the world of yoga in light of all of this historical, factual information to what we want to carry forwards through our engagement with these traditions now and into the future. So I think yeah, there's a lot of fertile ground for us to explore, but obviously these are some quite contentious topics potentially. People have strong opinions, and so I look forward to charting our way through that terrain. And I think the first thing I really feel moved to ask you is, obviously about this feminist lens. The world of yoga today is predominantly female, certainly, in the globalized context of making shapes on mats. And yeah, at the same time, we go back into the history of yoga and look at all of these texts that people study, look at what we can see from art, historical materials, even sculpture. There are a lot more men than women, and where women do appear, we don't hear very much about them. So I wonder, where are the women, and what does this tell us? The fact that we're even asking that question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. And I first want to share some of the backstory of why I
Hmm.
even brought this book into being, or I am endeavoring to answer these very big questions about a feminist lens on yoga and a feminist lens on history and why that is even important. It actually started around about 5 to 7, maybe even 7 to 8 years ago, and it started with an Instagram post by a very renowned, popular American yoga teacher who said that it was the West who sort of liberated women into practicing yoga. And he meant asana. And in the context of, we see more women practicing yoga right now than historically in evidence of like paintings. And I don't know what his evidence was, but that's what I kind of read into it. And in the context of that, all tradition does not necessarily mean that it's a good thing, that sometimes tradition can be oppressive. And this was a teacher who I have practiced with and I respect, and I knew that he was not trying to make a sensationalist Instagram declaration. So, but that got me really curious. And I was at that time teaching in hospitals and cancer centers. Um, my focus was very different, but those sort of questions have always sort of lingered in my mind about history and the lens of into history. And I had not connected the dots into a lens of like a feminist lens into yoga history. So that got me digging. I'm a nerd. I'm a very self-professed nerd. So I started studying and reading, and I started looking at the different verses in, for example, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which talks about, avoid fires, travel, bad people, and women, because those are sort of detrimental to the practice of yoga. And I started reading about even Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which kind of talk about, which are geared toward more of the male practitioner, right?
Hmm.
So some of these are the texts which we are studying as contemporary yoga practitioners, both in the Western world as well as India. Those are the two points of references that I make because I kind of go back and forth between the two. Um, so long story short, that got me thinking into where are the women practitioners in yoga. And I love art. For me, art is and by that I mean visual art as well as performing art, dance as well as paintings and sculpture. And I looked at all these sort of as sources of really rich material for us to see and place uh, women practitioners, right? And I saw, like you said, a lot of the temple sculptures have women in dancerish poses, whereas ascetics were men, right? There are very few ascetic women. Uh, there are some paintings, for example, the 17th century yoginis, the Nath yoginis, that's a very popular, famous one. So I saw this sort of dichotomy emerge where uh, performing arts were for the women, the dancer, the musician, etc., whereas the ascetics were mostly men. And that got me digging through many of uh, sort of sociology of the text, and so that's the lens that I kind of bring into the book. The and that I still did not think that I was ready to write a book. I mean, it's for me, a book writing is not something that I take lightly. I got into a PhD program because I really wanted to understand, from an academic perspective, what are some of the underlying theoretical frameworks of, say, women's spirituality or feminist history, and those are the kind of lenses that I started bringing together and weaving together into the book. uh, and at the same time, I also want to uh, I did not want to just make it like, and I did not do not have the uh, sort of the capacity even now, I think, to bring in a purely academic sort of a lens. I wanted to kind of bridge that gap between academia and practice, because I do think that there is a gap, especially in the yoga world. There is scholarship who are doing amazing, really great research, and at the same time there are practitioners who have no idea about what the research is, right? So my I hope the book is a sort of a bridging together of scholarship, which has got some rigor into research, and as well as, okay, now we have all this information about the past. um, how do we translate that into action? What are some of the things that we can do to critique the practice of yoga and look at history in a slightly more expanded way? So that's where I come from.
Well, you end these chapters of the book with some, points for reflection and suggestions for, contemplations that might expand one's perspective, as you say, perhaps by rubbing up against some of the challenging material that we do find in the past. And yeah, if we look back to ancient India, and it's by no means exclusive in this respect, obviously, it's yeah, a sad fact of the history of the world that men have wielded power over women. And the description, in a way, of what a woman's duty was very tightly constrained in ancient Indian sources. And yeah, we can debate perhaps how literally these lines were interpreted, but you quote one in the book from the Manu Smriti, or the Manava Dharma Shastra, to give it its fancy title, that says a woman must never act independently. So yeah, the whole life of an ascetic is really kind of off limits to a female who has male relatives, because her duty, in a way, is to serve her male relatives, be they her husband, her parents, or offspring. And unless all those people have gone, you haven't really got freedom to renounce. So female practice isn't going to show up in the same way as a result of that, even if the women were writing texts, which clearly they weren't.
Well, so the like you mentioned, the Stri Dharma, the duty of the woman, was very well, or rigorously defined in many of the texts from the Manav Dharma Shastra, and then it kind of gets more referred into the other epics like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, where the Brahmin women, the people with caste privilege, the Kshatriya women, the Vaishya women, especially the three sort of big Varna categories, have very defined roles for the women in society. They are the what we call as sahadharminis. They are the participants, co-participants, supportive, who play a supportive role for the man to fulfill the duties of his varna, and his ashrama, the life stage of a person. And that is true in the uh, the people with caste privilege, right? So Manava Dharma Shastra, Manusmriti, was of course written with the Brahmin practitioner or Brahmin man as sort of the center, and these are sort of the didacts that Manu, the sage Manu, was giving to or sharing to the Brahmin man, and of course the Kshatriya man too, as a person who's sort of protective of that social order. Um, so yeah, so depending on the periods of sort of history, and there are different ways of looking at history, and one one way to which is sort of helpful, because it is so vast and so scattered, if you will, is to figure out, is to sort of uh, have yoga history in terms of periods, right? So there is pre-Vedic, if you will, or the Harappan, if you count that as a part of yoga history. Then there is the Vedic period, then there is the Puranic period, and then there is the, Bhakti Renaissance, and then the colonial period, and so on and so forth. So depending on which period you see these sort of, if you're looking at the of the role of women, they are defined and understood and experienced also differently depending on the caste positionality. So to go back to my own studies of, the role of women, or the what do you say, uh, the place of women in history, we have to bring in caste, because each uh, caste or class, the women experience their own life in different ways. So caste plays a big role in a way a woman experiences life. So that sort of I had to bring in that as a very important factor that intersects through the book. I come from caste privilege. I am a Savarna. I am a Brahmin woman, and of course, it's a big category. Brahmin also doesn't mean that there are different categories of Brahmin. I'm a fish eating Brahmin, for example, right? I come from the coastal part of Karnataka, and those are not considered to be quote unquote the pure Brahmin who can go and do the pujas in the temple, for example. So we don't have that authority. So it's far more complicated. And I don't know whether our conversation right now will have the capacity to hold that. But what I'm trying to say is that depending on the caste category, class category, the woman role in society is defined differently in the text, going back to the text.
Well, let's maybe just bring in a few terms just to clarify. I mean, this word caste is obviously not an indigenous Indian term, and you used the earliest language Varna, which is going right back to the Rig Veda. It literally means color, and that's describing, a fourfold distinction initially. But before that, perhaps there was only three groups, and there wasn't really an underclass. That's partly the evolution of an idea through the encounter of a group of people with those who are sort of outside of its mental space, and they are, in some ways, the barbarians, so to speak, the polluting influence that has to be somehow tamed. So once that happens, then there's an increasing stratification that creeps into traditions. But also there is this other word that we haven't yet mentioned, jati, which relates literally to birth. So, these groups that are defined by inherited responsibilities, and the two intersect, and it's a very complex web, really. We've got, I think, perhaps an oversimplified understanding of it, partly because
Yes,
colonial Brits came along, saw this as a wonderful way to divide and rule, and helped to
exactly.
entrench all of these divisions. Which does lead some these days to try and pretend that they were all a British creation, and actually, in the magical pre-colonial era, there was no caste. But that's definitely
Exactly.
not true.
Right. Absolutely. It's definitely not true that caste was created by the British. It was institutionalized in some ways and entrenched as a part of governance because of census and those kind of things. But even that was not that was also not um, what do you say, solid. The census categories changed over times, right? So there was the thing called Sikh Hindus in the beginning, and then they decided, oh, Sikh and Hindus are completely different, and so then they created two different categories. So all those things, and they continue to evolve in many ways. So was there a question at the end of
That
at the end
wasn't
of your?
actually. I think I just sort of exhaled a bit of information, and perhaps we need to sort of
Yeah,
distill that into something that we can
yeah.
inhale and contemplate.
Yeah, so to go back to your reference to jati, it is an important
Hmm.
one because, in fact, most people in India, and again, caste is across many regions of South Asia. So it's not only India, but I'm only referring to India because that's my, lived experience, and some sort of knowledge is based in India. I we When we refer to caste in India, we are actually talking about jati. We say which jati are, or like what jati are you? Or I mean, not that we ask that openly, because sometimes it's all embedded sort of cultural knowledge. But those are the, or we call it as an intercaste marriage because it is a marriage between caste. Also, castes can sometimes be used synonymously with religion, which is sometimes interesting for people who don't, who cannot understand the cultural, linguistic references to it. So, jati is far more accurate reference to a person's quote unquote caste, because as you said, the word caste itself comes from the Portuguese word casta. So yeah, so I, for example, my jati would be a Gauda Saraswat Brahmin, which is, I'm from the Gaud region. I'm a Saraswat along the Konkan coast, and I'm a Brahmin. So those are the different sort of caste jati categories.
Thank you. Yeah, and then I think the other thing that we need to bring into the mix is obviously yoga and yogic texts. And the reason I'm even discussing this is because it's kind of unavoidable. Yeah, one of the most quoted, most studied sources for yogic philosophy is the Bhagavad Gita. And in the very first chapter, the word jati pops up as the thing that must be defended in a way, the maintenance of jati dharma, the duty that is inherited, and that all of this will be lost if dharma, in a broader sense, righteousness, justice, is not preserved. So Arjuna on the battlefield at the start of the Bhagavad Gita is confused as to what to do because he basically has to go to war with his own family. He thinks
Mhm.
that's in some way it's so immoral that it will unwind the fabric of society and lead to the intermingling of castes. And so that's all
Mhm.
there as the framing for yoga teachings. And, that's something that can't be wished away, unfortunately. But why should it bother us now, as
Mm.
particularly 21st century Westerners engaged in a largely physical practice, that there are old texts from another culture, another time, that happen to have some things in them that are awkward? After all, we find those in any religious text from 2000 years ago.
Mm. That's a really good question. And I just want to share that, Bhagavad Gita is one of my go-to texts. Like
Hmm.
personally, for my personal practice, I have a Bhagavad Gita here, which was gifted to me by my mom. And whenever I'm in a very, place where I need to figure out what to do with a particular thing, I somehow refer to the Bhagavad Gita, and it's I started learning the Bhagavad Gita when I was or chanting the Bhagavad Gita since I was in a teenager, a young, as I've written in the book, a young Brahmin man who was very charismatic and charming, made it very appealing. And I love the lyricism of the chants. So it's by no way negation of the some of the other teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, right, which has shaped the cultural, social ethos of a population of people beyond just only quote unquote the Hindu tradition. It has shaped the entire understanding of, for example, dharma and karma, and because it is a far more accessible way of understanding these concepts in a very dramatic setting of a war and battlefield and the Mahabharata. So, to go to your question, Daniel, about why should we bother in the 21st century, especially as yoga practitioners, is because it has really not been understood much in terms of the context of the teachings, the context of the composition. The So to understand why that the Mahabharata was composed, how did the Bhagavad Gita get into it? It was composed over centuries, of course, and it was creative. Layers were added to it, etc. But also that all texts are not sort of timeless repositories of eternal truths, right? They are shaped, they are shifted. It's a dynamic thing. They impact the material lives of people, right? So as a person who is from caste privilege, I can love Bhagavad Gita and I can share all that because that was what my parents taught me, and my teachers taught me, etc. Now, from a person from another positionality who has been oppressed by the caste system, the Bhagavad Gita is absolutely harmful. right? So because it talks about caste and that to mingle with people who are from different castes itself is the varna samkara, as we say, where the intermingling of caste itself is a thing to be challenged and fought against at any cost, right? So those sort of concepts shape the material, psychological, dare I say, spiritual lives of people who are harmed and oppressed by the caste system. So many people who are caste oppressed will not want to come to a Bhagavad Gita teaching, Bhagavad Gita course, because that's actually harmful. And so, from Dr. Ambedkar to Jyotirao Phule to Gail Wet, all these are Uma Chakravarti. These are all the scholars who have uh, criticized, and understood that some of these teachings that are embedded in sort of spiritual, quote unquote, or religious containers, and talked about how this has impacted the material lives of people who have been harmed by the caste system. So in that sense, if we are to look at yoga as a sort of a liberatory practice, we have to also take in the tensions of oppression, of the threads of oppression, and uh, the historical context of the composition. And I would say that's why we need to learn it and study it and critique it and understand it, and then see what we want to do with it.
Thank you. Yeah, you've got some lovely metaphors in the book that help with this process. I mean, you start with one in the form of a quilt. It can be woven out of lots of different fabric and bits and pieces, some of which are very pretty and others less so. And therefore, it's possible to have a text like the Gita that has inspiring messages alongside others that are slightly less so. We've also got a lovely metaphor as well for Hindu traditions more broadly, is in relation to curry, and there being no one curry powder, but an infinite variety of masalas that can be mixed and matched according to taste, and also regional context. So there are many different ways of putting together some of these principles. But I do feel moved to draw attention to a couple of Gita verses that perhaps are more inspiring for people of marginalized groups, but we can also perhaps critique why they're there. So there's the 18th verse in the 5th chapter that says, "The wise see the same Atman in everybody from a Brahmin to an outcast, one who eats dogs," basically, it says. And then also the 32nd verse of the 9th chapter, which is the sort of, the bone that's thrown to the oppressed, says, "You can all get liberated if you're devoted to Krishna, but that basically
Exactly.
means staying in your caste lane and don't try and look for a better station in life. Do loving service in your inherited duty, and then even women and shudras, the sort of underclass, may go to the highest goal." In some ways, the Gita might be taking things away, but it's also, it's offering something in return. Otherwise, I don't think many people would buy it.
It is, but and as you said, that it is throwing that line to say, hey, but perform your duty. That is the whole thing, right? The dharma of what? The dharma of your varna, right? And in the Gita, and elsewhere too, it says it's better to do your own duty in a good way rather than someone else's duty in any other way. And Mahabharata was composed at a time, and I've written this in the book as well, that it was composed at a time when there were increasing clashes between the Buddhists, the bubbling Buddhist traditions, the Jain, the Shramana traditions, as well as the Brahminical religions. So we have to take that into account. Also, the history of the compositions, and which not many people in the mainstream yoga world do. So they just take these phrases of the Gita, and then they assume that for everyone there has to be this amazing reaction, but it is not. So that's what I wanted to kind of like bring in here, that not everybody will feel the same way about some of these texts about of quote unquote yoga. Uh, and it's based on a person's positionality and lived experience and history, intergenerational history, right? So so that's one of the reasons why I think studying this in context to caste and gender and patriarchy and class, etc., is important as modern day practitioners.
Well, we can't avoid those things, can we? I mean, they are part of reality. Yeah, there are power structures. There are ways in which people are privileged over others, and at the same time that others are in this position of marginalization. And so you have to accept that's part of life. But there was something that struck me in the book, which I'm really curious to ask you about, and that's that. The liberating potential of yoga is to point beyond all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of your inspiring examples from ancient history of a rare case of a female ascetic, and no less a female ascetic who gets to lord it over a king who claims to be enlightened, Sulabha in the Mahabharata. She's basically winning this debate by pointing in all sorts of ways beyond distinctions, and to say that the true self is not man or woman. But the one thing she does tell the king is, because you're caught up in worldliness, you can't go beyond distinctions. You've got friends and enemies. You're trying to wield power. So it is actually only the renouncer who can get liberated. So we can come back to that a bit later, because what does that say for the poor women who's stuck in the house as a potential
Exactly.
conduit to freedom? But also more broadly, though, this idea that the true self isn't affected by all of these distinctions, and that the Gita, therefore, might still be pointing in a similar direction to one of those inspiring examples beyond all of that. And on the one hand, that's a great blessing, because in a society as riddled with inequality as India, people can still find some spiritual peace amidst all of the difficulty they struggle with. And yet at the same time, it can be a great curse, because it stops efficient organization to ameliorate a lot of that suffering and improve conditions, because there's a sort of acceptance of things, and an embrace of the possibility of transcending this terrible worldliness with some spiritual splendor. So I wonder what you make of that. Thanks for tuning in to this preview. To continue listening and to get access to all archived episodes along with other perks, visit ancientfutures.substack.com.